We have more for your ears only. I'm David Alpern.
I'm Catherine Herzog with this news quote. It's an incredible moment in the struggle for gay rights in this country. That was ACLU project director James D. Essex after a federal appeals court in New York ruled unconstitutional the National Defense of Marriage Act that had forced a local woman to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes on an estate she inherited from the woman to whom she was legally married, which would not have applied if her spouse had been male. The decision moves the issue of same-sex marriage yet closer to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now this.
Bad news, go away, call round someday in March or May. I can't be bothered now. My bonds and shares may fall downstairs. Who cares? Who cares? I'm dancing and I can't be bothered now.
Most of us can't dance away bad news like Fred Astaire in the 1937 film Damsel in Distress. In fact, many of us find it hard to forget the negative and violent images that the media and the internet serve up 24/7. From essential reporting on war in Afghanistan and massacres in Syria to the tabloid fare of punch-throwing housewives, there's no denying that tragedy and violence have become staples of modern American media.
Over time, exposure to all this bad news takes a toll on us, especially women. A new study shows that women exposed to disturbing news stories suffer an emotional blow far greater than men who are able to forget violent images and stories more easily. The good news is that the more we learn about just how bad news affects us, the more we learn about how to cope with it all.
Sean Mashore takes a look at the bad news in our lives and how we can limit its impact on our well-being in his new book, The Bliss Experiment, from Simon & Schuster's Atria Books. In it, Mashore draws on some 500 scientific studies to reveal how our brains are wired to handle all of today's outside media influences and how to best shield ourselves beyond terminating our TV and computer use altogether. And for your ears only, Sean Mashore joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
First, give us an idea of what the average person is exposed to in terms of bad news in our era of the 24-hour news cycle, compared to just 5, 10, even 20 years ago.
Well, I think that the word 24 sums it up pretty perfectly. If you think about just, say, 20 years ago, or what you might call the pre-CNN era, which maybe that's 30 years ago now, most of us got our news, especially our visual news, during the 6 o'clock news hour, and it lasted for 30 minutes, actually less than 30 minutes with commercials, and that was it. And then a smaller percentage of the population read the newspaper every morning, which they skimmed through, had very few images. They could skip around in stories. They could kind of control their exposure, in other words, and that was it. That was all we really knew. Now, there are so many news networks and that all broadcast 24 hours. Every single event is broadcast that happens. There's analysis. There's all the websites that are constantly updating 24 hours a day. It's not a once-a-day newspaper kind of update. There's the blogs, and then our ability not just to absorb it, but everyone's got comment section now, and we can have our own personal blogs, and so we're constantly thinking about it.
How does the increase in bad news correlate to more mental and emotional strain, as best science can judge?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of research about that, actually. And what we know is that the more we expose ourselves to negative things, depressing things, anxiety-producing things, the more that transfers to us. And it's really very overwhelming. There's study after study, and it's even very specific to things like watching the news that shows the more we watch the news, the more likely we are to become anxious, depressed, angry, judgmental, and all kinds of negative emotions.
But isn't some bad news actually good for us? Can in-depth coverage of war and violence help sway an unengaged public to become more involved in political and civic issues the way Vietnam begat a decisive anti-war movement?
That's a great question. And of course, the answer to that is yes. But there's this kind of line that we all have to find. It's different for each one of us. Being informed is a key part of the democratic process. We have to know what's going on, and we have to take action based upon that. However, when inside yourself you notice that there's been like a tipping point reached where you're so depressed, so anxious, so angry that it's become a negative thing where you're no longer just an informed citizen participating in our democracy, but your life is being deeply affected by that. That's a sign that you're absorbing too much of the negativity. And what you can do at that point is you can step back from the media a little bit, and you won't lose your knowledge. You won't lose your basic ability to participate, but you can stop absorbing so much of it again and again when you're already too full of it.
What's different exactly about the female brain or brain function that makes it harder for women to let go of disturbing news? Is it somehow connected to female empathy?
I personally think it probably is more likely empathy-based. My wife and I were just talking about this last night. She was saying just the same thing. Little things affect her. They roll right off of me, where she really can be affected by them. I do think a lot of it is that women tend to be more feeling-based, and that in a positive way means that sense of empathy and compassion. The flip side of it, though, is that men have the same capacity. We just haven't always developed it as much. And so it is that feeling kind of leading that we connect emotionally with what we're seeing and absorbing. And you have to remember, the one thing I want to say about all these scientific studies, including the one in the LA Times that sort of predicated this conversation we're having, is that none of these studies are 100% one way or the other. In it, there was a majority of women who responded in one way, but that didn't mean no men in the study responded at all the same way the women did, and vice versa. Some of the women responded more in what you might call the masculine fashion. And so ultimately it's an individual thing, but there are those sort of gender breakdowns that are more of guidelines than hard and fast rules that apply to everyone.
Sean Mashor is the author of The Bliss Experiment from Simon & Schuster's Atria Books.
Quote from the news, "You can't turn back, an inexorable trend." That was Tina Brown, editor of the Daily Beast online and Newsweek, announcing that the weekly magazine would cease print publication at year's end to help cut $40 million in annual losses. Its former radio show, Newsweek on Air, continues as For Your Ears Only. Us.
Next, Songs of the Canyon, the soul of 60s folk rock revolution. For Your Ears Only.